Moving to the big international story, protesters had given Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak until today to leave office. Mubarak says he wants to step down immediately but cannot do so because he fears the country will sink deeper into chaos.
It's the biggest gathering Tahrir Square has seen in the last 11 days. Reports of around 1 million protesters descending on Cairo for what anti-Mubarak protesters declared the day of departure for embattled President Hosni Mubarak, who still seems to be going nowhere, much to the frustration of many.
Everybody in Egypt won't leave now, not tomorrow. All things destroyed. What you want from people now, Hosni Mubarak, leave now.
But those that support Mubarak dubbed Friday the day of loyalty. Seemingly aware of the international outcry after allowing protesters to clash with one another, army personnel were out in force, forming barricades between the two sides, trying to prevent the bloodshed of the past 2 days. Mubarak says he wants to go, but he can't because the country will descend into chaos. But 27 European Union leaders have issued a joint statement demanding transition to begin now. The Obama administration is reportedly also in talks with top Egyptian officials about Mubarak's possible immediate resignation as president.
Well, one of Newsnight's own writers, Mohammed Patel, was caught up in the chaos at Cairo's airport as many international tourists tried to flee the country. He returned to South Africa today and joins us now. Mohammed, welcome back. We're so glad to see you.
Thank you.
So what were you doing in Egypt?
Nikiwa, I was just in Egypt in transit. I was supposed to be there for about 3 hours, and that 3 hours ended up being 4 days. I found out my flight was cancelled, and the authorities told us that, come back in the morning and speak to us. In the morning, nothing had changed, and it was just absolute chaos in the airport.
How did they tell you that this is what was happening? Your flights had been changed?
They actually didn't tell us at all. We had to obviously see on the computer screens that the flight had been cancelled. There were no announcements over the PA system or anything of that sort. So we were just left there to fend for ourselves and figure out what to do on our own.
Did you know what was happening in the country at that time?
I did know there was some unrest. I didn't know it was as bad. And at that stage, I didn't know about the curfew that was in place either. And it was because of the curfew that crew members and pilots were not able to come to the airport, and that is why there was such chaos with flights being cancelled.
So eventually they tell you to come back the next day, and what happens then?
The next day there's hundreds of people literally lining up at the counter. Everyone's trying to speak to one of the officials, but no one was really being helpful enough. They would just tell you, come back later, and if you'd come back and you'd find nothing had changed, you just didn't know what was going on.
At that stage, were you able to move in and out of the airport?
Not really. I wasn't actually sure whether if I went outside the airport, whether I'd be able to come back. And obviously with the situation being so volatile outside, I was a bit scared that, I didn't know what would happen if I went outside either.
So you eventually ended up spending 4 days. How were other people reacting? Was this absolute chaos?
It was absolute chaos. People were really scared. They went from being scared to frustrated. Authorities, as I said before, no one made any official, announcements as to what people should do. So people were just left wondering what they should do. I walked around seeing mothers absolutely just crying, people banging at doors and shouting. It was absolute chaos.
Did they
a
feed
real
you?
nightmare. At first they gave us vouchers where we could collect a meal. Towards the end, there was actually some food. I arrived on Saturday night, and there was a bit of food there at the time, but towards Sunday and Monday the food started to run out. So the airport staff were giving passengers vouchers, which were then, they could get the meals from the plane.
What was going through your mind as you had to go through all of this? I mean, you were on holiday and you were simply in transit.
Yes, I was simply in transit. Going through my mind was just getting out of there. I wanted to get out any way possible. I didn't care whether they would send me to, whichever country it may be. I just wanted to get out of Egypt at that time.
And how did you eventually come back home?
Eventually, I decided that I would go outside of the airport. I'm also an Australian citizen, and I found a group of Australians sitting outside, and they told me the embassy was going to be helping us. And so on Wednesday, they organized flights out of Cairo with Qantas, and that's how I actually got out.
Relieved to be back home?
Absolutely relieved.
Sure. We're glad to have you back, Mohammed. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was Mohammed Patel, Newsnight writer who was stuck at Cairo's airport for 4 days.